The Krypteia was more than an institution. It was the structural spine of Spartan dominance, a system designed to ensure that the polis could endure despite the constant threat posed by the helot majority. These subjugated people, essential to Sparta's economy, were physically and numerically superior to the citizen population, yet their labor was indispensable. The Krypteia transformed this latent danger into a controlled instrument of state authority. Young Spartan men, trained rigorously in the agoge, were selected for their physical endurance, tactical skill, and psychological resilience. They were conditioned to endure hunger, exposure, and fatigue, to suppress fear, and to operate independently, applying skills honed in childhood to lethal effect. Under cover of darkness, they moved silently through olive groves, cultivated fields, and rugged hillsides, observing helots for strength, influence, or leadership potential. Targets were carefully selected, and eliminations were executed with precision. Each operation removed immediate threats while broadcasting a silent, omnipresent warning. Resistance carried the certainty of death. Politically, the Krypteia was embedded within Sparta's uniquely structured governance. The dual kingship, the Ephyrs, and the Gerousia collectively regulated the balance of power. One king typically led military campaigns abroad, while the other supervised domestic affairs, and the Ephyrs enforced legal and civic oversight. Within this framework, the Krypteia operated in a liminal space, sanctioned to act decisively, yet invisible to the general population. Its secrecy permitted Spartan authorities to neutralize internal threats without provoking unrest or sympathy for the helots. Compliance was internalized. The anticipation of lethal enforcement created self-regulating behavior among the oppressed. Helots were never certain when or where the Krypteia would strike, a pervasive uncertainty that reinforced submission without the need for overt displays of power. Fear itself became a governance tool, as effective as any walls, militia, or tribunal could have been. Operationally, the Krypteia integrated reconnaissance, intelligence, and execution into a continuous system. Young Spartans memorized helot routines, labor patterns, and social hierarchies, identifying individuals capable of organizing resistance or influencing others. Execution required speed, discretion, and efficiency. Operatives carried minimal equipment, daggers, short spears, and small clubs, designed for silent action rather than open conflict. Seasonal timing was critical. Missions coincided with periods of social vulnerability, such as harvests or post-mobilization, when community routines were disrupted. By acting preemptively, Sparta neutralized threats before rebellion could coalesce. The Krypteia functioned as an intelligence apparatus, strike force, and psychological instrument simultaneously, demonstrating a strategic understanding that internal control required both action and perception. The psychological impact on helots was pervasive and enduring. Fear governed daily life. Individuals suppressed displays of strength, assertiveness, and leadership, and even routine labor. Plowing, transporting produce, or gathering for communal work was carried out under constant vigilance. The Krypteia's invisibility amplified the terror. Helots could not predict when or where enforcement would occur. Compliance was internalized and habitual. Fear regulated social behavior as effectively as any explicit rule. Communities developed defensive structures, emphasizing secrecy, restraint, and obedience. Anticipation replaced direct enforcement as the primary mechanism of control. Through this combination of psychological pressure and physical threat, the Krypteia produced a population that maintained productivity while remaining subservient, internalizing submission as a condition of survival. Historical sources underline the deliberate and systematic nature of these operations. Plutarch records the targeted elimination of the strongest and most influential helots, those capable of organizing resistance or leading rebellion. Knowledge of fratricide permeated the consciousness of subjects and foreign observers. European ambassadors, Venetian merchants, and Safavid spies recorded the tension suffusing Topkapi Palace. Rumors of imprisoned princes, executions by silken cords, and the clinical elimination of claimants created awe and fear. The Sultan appeared paternal yet predatory, offering protection but maintaining capacity for destruction. This perception reinforced loyalty, signaling that the ultimate arbiter of power would not tolerate challenge. Historical case studies illuminate these laws. Bayezid II's succession struggle exemplifies the lethal intersection of familial rivalry and necessity. His sons, Ahmed and Selim, represented competing visions, and their confrontation escalated to conflict. Ahmed's advantage was undermined by Selim's decisive moves, elimination of supporters, and alliances with janissaries. Once Selim secured Istanbul, fratricide was applied to Ahmed and brothers, cementing authority. Mehmed III, who executed 19 brothers upon accession, illustrates the scale and logic of the practice. These events were integral to Ottoman survival, demonstrating pragmatic ruthlessness embedded in law. Long-term consequences were profound. The empire avoided fragmentation common in other monarchies. Central authority was rarely contested, ensuring continuity in taxation, military command, and diplomacy. Yet the psychological toll shaped the dynasty. Princes raised in isolation, sometimes without governance experience, developed a cold rationality. Chroniclers noted sultans' calculated detachment, effective in preserving order but contributing to cruelty and suspicion. Fratricide enabled strategic transformation. Eliminating rivals allowed unambiguous succession, enabling investment in sophisticated governance structures. Governors understood the sultan's supremacy. Commanders knew loyalty was necessary. Cohesion permitted logistics, multi-theater campaigns, and fortification strategies across Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean. Fratricide, though grim, stabilized the empire and amplified strategic capacity. Broader geopolitical impact followed. Neighboring states recognized that Ottoman power relied not only on numbers or technology, but on ruthless certainty of succession. Diplomacy recorded the efficiency with which sultans neutralized internal threats. European powers recalibrated strategies, anticipating campaigns by rulers unburdened by contested legitimacy. The sultan's absolute authority reshaped perceptions across the eastern Mediterranean, establishing psychological dominance alongside military and economic strength. Codified fratricide, psychological conditioning, military integration, and legal justification created an ecosystem where Ottoman survival depended on brutal dynastic control. Executions were calculated, confinements preparatory, successions testament to relentless logic. Longevity owed much to this calculus. Without it, the empire's trajectory, its conquests, sieges, centralization, might have mirrored states undone by internecine violence. Human cost, measured in lives and psychological burden, was profound and irreversible. The empire endured through fear and precision, a reality that haunts historical memory. The architecture of succession cannot be separated from fratricide. It shaped palace design, military doctrine, and governance across territories. Princes, once potential allies, became liabilities to monitor, confine, and if necessary, eliminate. This duality, blood and power, loyalty and suspicion, was a constant undercurrent in political life. Campaigns were extensions of this logic, executed by leaders whose authority was absolute, whose legitimacy enforced through law, and whose ruthlessness was necessary and sanctioned. The Sultan's hand, veiled in ceremonial, was precise and lethal, shaping the empire's destiny through acts legal, strategic, and irrevocably aged. The Krypteia's operations were not arbitrary. Every action was a calculated reinforcement of Spartan authority, a manifestation of the state's understanding of power as both physical and psychological. These young men were immersed from childhood in the agoge, which molded them into disciplined, resilient, and calculating agents capable of functioning independently within hostile environments. Their training emphasized endurance, stealth, and tactical judgment, preparing them for missions where survival depended entirely on skill and discretion. The Krypteia represented the culmination of this preparation, applying lessons of obedience and resilience not to foreign enemies, but to the latent threat posed by Sparta's own subjugated population. In the darkness, moving silently through olive groves and cultivated fields, these youth enacted a grim calculus: eliminate potential helot leaders, destabilize incipient insurrectionary movements, and maintain an omnipresent aura of inevitability. The system functioned as both preemptive strike and psychological instrument, embedding fear into the fabric of daily life. The broader political framework intensified the stakes of these operations. Sparta's dual kingship, combined with the oversight of the ephors, created a delicate balance between centralized authority and shared governance. While the kings led armies in external campaigns, the ephors and the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, managed internal administration and discipline. The Krypteia operated at the intersection of these powers, bridging the gap between military enforcement and civic oversight. Its covert nature allowed Spartan elites to act decisively against internal threats without public scrutiny. Open violence risked galvanizing helot solidarity, yet clandestine suppression achieved compliance without visible disruption. This demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of governance. Authority was most effectively exercised when fear and uncertainty were pervasive, leaving the oppressed population in a state of constant vigilance and subordination. Operationally, the Krypteia combined reconnaissance and strike functions. Young Spartans surveilled helot communities, learning routines, hierarchies, and vulnerabilities. Target selection emphasized individuals displaying strength, leadership potential, or influence. Execution demanded precision. Survival depended on speed, stealth, and decisiveness. Historical sources suggest that Krypteia missions were seasonal, often coinciding with periods when revolt risk was highest, such as harvests or post-mobilization periods when social structures were temporarily destabilized. By focusing on predictive threats rather than reactive ones, Sparta transformed internal security into a proactive system, suppressing potential rebellion before it could materialize. Such anticipation maximized control while minimizing manpower expenditure, a strategic integration of military principles into domestic governance. The psychological effects of these operations on the helot population were profound and enduring. Fear became embedded in daily life, shaping behavior both individually and collectively. Helots developed hyper-awareness, monitoring surroundings for signs of surveillance or attack. Family units and communities adapted defensively, minimizing displays of strength or assertiveness that could attract attention. Even routine activities, plowing fields, transporting goods, assembling for work, occurred under the shadow of sudden, invisible violence. The Krypteia's invisibility intensified the terror. The population could not predict when, where, or how retribution would strike, creating a form of internalized compliance far more effective than overt punishment. Psychological domination reinforced structural control, ensuring Sparta's economic and military model functioned without allocating the full manpower conventional policing would have required. Historical evidence illustrates the deliberate, calculated nature of Krypteia violence. Accounts from Plutarch and Xenophon describe patterns in target selection, emphasizing systematic removal of potential threats. Strong, young men were particularly vulnerable, as their physical capacity made them both valuable laborers and potential sources of revolt. These killings had dual purposes. They eliminated immediate danger and transmitted a silent, omnipresent warning. By combining selective targeting with unpredictability, the Krypteia achieved strategic efficiency. Fewer resources maintained compliance, and fear became institutionalized. The message to the helot population was unmistakable. Spartan dominance extended beyond visible power into anticipation and perception. The consequences for Spartan society were equally significant. Participation in the Krypteia was formative, solidifying loyalty, resilience, and an understanding of power as enforcement rather than negotiation. Young men internalized the notion that authority and survival were intertwined with discretion and the capacity for violence. This created a feedback loop, reinforcing hierarchy externally, through subjugation of helots, and internally, through the conditioning of future leaders. The Krypteia functioned as a cultural instrument as well as a security mechanism, embedding principles of fear, obedience, and vigilance into the Spartan identity across generations. Its influence extended beyond operational objectives, shaping the ethical and psychological framework of the ruling class. Strategically, the Krypteia represented a profound innovation in internal security. Whereas Athens relied on walls, public trials, and militias, Sparta employed an invisible, sustained apparatus capable of controlling a numerically superior population. This allowed Spartan armies to focus on external campaigns while internal stability was maintained through targeted, preventive violence. The system integrated intelligence gathering, behavioral observation, and decisive action, anticipating modern principles of preemptive security. By merging tactical discipline with social engineering, Sparta created a system where psychological and physical enforcement were inseparable. The Krypteia exemplified a deliberate synthesis of surveillance, covert operations, and social control, an operational model unmatched among contemporaneous Greek city-states. The long-term impact on helots was pervasive, shaping labor practices, social cohesion, and demographic patterns. Fear constrained collective action, reducing revolt frequency and scale while preserving agricultural productivity. Communities adapted defensive behaviors, emphasizing concealment, compliance, and avoidance of attention. Over generations, the helots' social adaptations reinforced the permanence of Spartan dominance. The system's resilience lay in its ability to convert fear into self-regulation, minimizing direct oversight while maintaining societal hierarchy. The Krypteia created a population disciplined through anticipation, ensuring structural stability despite numerical vulnerability. Geopolitically, the Krypteia influenced Sparta's position in the Peloponnesus. Neighboring states recognized the efficiency and ruthlessness of Spartan internal control, enhancing deterrence. Potential adversaries and subject populations understood that rebellion invited both open warfare and clandestine elimination, creating layered enforcement. Sparta projected stability and discipline internally, reinforcing authority externally and legitimizing expansionist policies. In effect, the Krypteia functioned as an invisible extension of Spartan strategy, shaping behavior and perception to magnify influence without additional expenditure of conventional military resources. Through its operational, psychological, and strategic dimensions, the Krypteia emerges as an unparalleled system of internal control. By merging surveillance, selective violence, and psychological manipulation, Sparta secured its socio-political structure against the numerical majority of helots. It exemplified the integration of military training with civic governance, producing both immediate security and long-term cultural reinforcement. Participation instilled discipline, vigilance, decisiveness, and a comprehension of power as enforcement. For helots, terror defined daily existence. For Spartans, it preserved the integrity of a militarized oligarchy, sustaining dominance over the Peloponnesus. The Krypteia's efficiency and subtlety ensured that fear operated as an invisible mechanism, silently maintaining order and authority. In this sense, Carthage's legacy was not limited to what had happened in 146 BCE. It extended into how that event was used, interpreted, and integrated into broader narratives. The city's fall became part of a larger story about the rise and of Roman power. For the descendants of those directly affected, however, this level of abstraction was distant. Their identities had long since been reshaped within the structures of the empire. Any connection to Carthage existed as ancestry rather than lived experience. Over generations, even this connection could fade, replaced by new affiliations and frameworks. The process of assimilation, combined with the passage of time, ensured that the original rupture became less visible at the individual level. Yet at the structural level, it's remained. The integration of North Africa into the Roman system, the precedent of total destruction, and the reshaping of historical narrative all traced back to the same event. The sack of Carthage was not an isolated episode. It was that influenced multiple trajectories: political, economic, cultural, and intellectual. By the later centuries of the empire, the Mediterranean world had been fundamentally transformed. Rome's dominance, supported by integrated provinces and networks, created a degree of stability that had not existed before. This stability, however, was built upon earlier of expansion and, including the elimination of major rivals. Carthage had been one of the most significant of those rivals. Its destruction removed a competing center of power and open space for Roman consolidation. The consequences of that removal continued to shape the world that followed, even as the memory of the event itself became more distant. In this way, the fate of Carthage existed on two levels. As a historical, it belonged to a specific moment in the 2nd century BCE. As a legacy, it extended far beyond that moment, influencing systems and narratives long after the city had ceased to exist in its original form. The Krypteia was not a mere policing mechanism. It was the culmination of Spartan philosophy, where discipline, lethality, and psychological control converged. By the classical period, Spartan youth had undergone the agoge, a rigorous system designed to cultivate endurance, obedience, and tactical skill. These boys had been trained to endure hunger, fatigue, and exposure, to move silently, to observe without being seen, and to act decisively under extreme stress. The skills they acquired in abstract exercises were fully realized in the field. Operating at night, young men traversed olive groves, rocky hillsides, and cultivated fields, observing and tracking helots whose strength, leadership, or defiance threatened the fragile equilibrium of Spartan society. Their actions were never indiscriminate. They were deliberate, surgical, and designed to prevent revolt before it could manifest. Each disappearance sent a silent warning. The Krypteia functioned as a proactive instrument of control, blending tactical precision with psychological manipulation, ensuring Spartan dominance through fear rather than continuous public enforcement. Politically, the Krypteia operated within the intricate framework of Spartan governance. The dual kingship, with one king leading campaigns abroad and the other overseeing domestic matters, created a system of distributed authority. Oversight by the ephors, annually elected magistrates, and the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, centralized power while maintaining elite consensus. Within this structure, the Krypteia occupied a liminal position, neither fully military nor fully civilian, yet sanctioned to act decisively in secrecy. Its covert operations allowed Spartan elites to eliminate potential threats without public spectacle, preventing sympathy for helots and avoiding unrest among lower-status citizens. The system relied on the perception of omnipresent authority. Helots understood that the Krypteia could strike at any moment, internalizing compliance and creating a self-regulating social order. Fear itself became a mechanism of governance, operating invisibly and continuously to maintain the hierarchy without the need for constant supervision. Operationally, the Krypteia combined surveillance, intelligence gathering, and lethal execution. Young Spartans memorized helot routines, social structures, and communal hierarchies. Targets were chosen based on strength, influence, and potential for leadership or rebellion. Execution demanded speed, stealth, and decisiveness, often with minimal equipment such as daggers, short spears, or clubs, optimized for silent efficiency. Missions occurred seasonally, often during harvests or following military mobilizations when social structures were temporarily unstable. By acting preemptively, Sparta neutralized threats before they could coalesce into revolt, maintaining dominance despite the helots' numerical superiority. The Krypteia blended reconnaissance, tactical action, and psychological control, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of preventive governance that integrated military skill into domestic oversight. The psychological consequences for the helots were profound. Fear pervaded daily life, shaping both individual and collective behavior. Communities adapted defensively, suppressing any display of strength, initiative, or assertiveness. Ordinary tasks, plowing, transporting goods, assembling for labor, were undertaken under constant vigilance. The invisibility of the Krypteia intensified this terror. Helots could not predict when or where enforcement would occur, ensuring habitual compliance. This internalized fear functioned as a self-regulating system, reducing the need for direct supervision while maximizing obedience. Psychological domination became inseparable from governance, embedding control into the very fabric of helot society. Historical accounts emphasize the systematic nature of Krypteia operations. Plutarch describes the deliberate targeting of the strongest and most influential helots, those capable of inspiring revolt. Xenophon corroborates that these actions were strategic, focusing on neutralizing potential threats rather than inflicting random cruelty. Selective targeting combined with unpredictability maximized both physical and psychological effects. By removing leaders and capable individuals, Sparta ensured the helots remained subdued and compliant. The threat of sudden, unexplained elimination reinforced authority, teaching that resistance carried fatal consequences. The Krypteia functioned simultaneously as enforcement and social education, instilling the perception that rebellion was impossible without inviting death. For Spartan participants, the Krypteia was formative. It instilled loyalty, decisiveness, and an understanding of power as enforcement rather than negotiation. Participation reinforced hierarchy externally through the subjugation of helots, and internally by producing a disciplined generation capable of sustaining social order. The experience shaped Spartan identity, embedding vigilance, discipline, and ruthlessness into the ethos of the polis. It was both a tool of control and a vehicle for cultural indoctrination, ensuring continuity of values across generations. The Krypteia fused operational necessity with social education, transmitting the principles of Spartan dominance through action and experience. Strategically, the Krypteia was exceptional among Greek city-states. Whereas Athens relied on walls, militias, and public justice, Sparta implemented a preemptive, invisible system capable of maintaining control over a majority population without excessive manpower. Intelligence gathering, careful observation, and decisive intervention formed a proactive framework of security. This allowed Sparta to maintain internal stability while deploying conventional forces externally. By integrating psychological and tactical methods, Sparta created a durable, self-reinforcing structure of dominance. Control was exercised efficiently, sustaining the social hierarchy and preserving a militarized society that could withstand internal and external pressures. The long-term consequences for helots were profound. Fear constrained social cohesion, discouraged collective action, and ensured labor productivity essential to Sparta's economy. Villages developed defensive behaviors, emphasizing concealment, restraint, and compliance. Over generations, these adaptations reinforced the permanence of Spartan dominance. The Krypteia embedded terror invisibly into daily life, creating a population disciplined through anticipation rather than continuous supervision. Obedience became habitual and internalized, ensuring the persistence of the social order and safeguarding the polis' structural integrity. Fear itself became an instrument of statecraft, silently sustaining the dominance of a militarized elite. Geopolitically, the Krypteia strengthened Sparta's position in the Peloponnesus. Neighboring states recognized the efficiency and ruthlessness of its internal control. Any potential rebellion risked both conventional military retaliation and clandestine elimination, amplifying deterrence. By projecting stability and discipline internally, Sparta reinforced its external authority, legitimizing expansionist policies and deterring defection. The Krypteia functioned as a strategic extension of governance, shaping behavior and perception across regions. Its invisible operations complemented conventional military strength, ensuring that both internal and external spheres of influence were maintained without unnecessary resource expenditure. Through operational precision, psychological manipulation, and strategic foresight, the Krypteia exemplified an unparalleled system of internal control. Surveillance, selective violence, and anticipation secured the Spartan state against threats from a numerically superior population. Participation instilled vigilance, decisiveness, and comprehension of power as enforcement. For Helots, it dictated life through fear. For Spartans, it preserved a militarized culture across generations. By embedding terror invisibly, the Krypteia created a self-regulating system of dominance, ensuring that obedience, restraint, and control became naturalized elements of Spartan society. Its efficiency, subtlety, and strategic integration demonstrate the deliberate, calculated nature of Sparta's internal governance, sustaining one of the most rigid and enduring militarized civilizations of the ancient world. The Krypteia's operations were not isolated incidents. They were embedded within the wider framework of Spartan societal control, a system in which surveillance, lethal precision, and psychological domination intersected to maintain the state's fragile equilibrium. For the Helots, life under Spartan rule was defined by the omnipresent possibility of death. The Krypteia's young operatives, trained in the agoge, were disciplined in observation, endurance, and decisive action. These skills, cultivated in controlled environments, were applied in real-world conditions, where stealth, knowledge of terrain, and tactical awareness determined success or failure. Missions were conducted under cover of darkness, moving through olive groves, fields, and village lanes, seeking those helots whose strength, leadership, or perceived ambition posed a threat to Sparta's hierarchical stability. Each elimination served a dual purpose, removing a potential insurgent and reinforcing terror across the broader population. The invisible yet systematic presence of the Krypteia transformed fear into a method of governance, a silent mechanism that maintained compliance without visible confrontation. Politically, the Krypteia occupied a unique and strategic position. Sparta's dual kingship, the Council of Elders, and the Ephors created a complex balance of power that required careful management of both internal and external threats. While kings often commanded armies and campaigns abroad, the Ephors and Gerousia controlled domestic administration and judicial oversight. The Krypteia, acting in secrecy, allowed Spartan authorities to preemptively suppress potential rebellion without drawing public scrutiny. Its function exemplified the integration of military expertise with political strategy. Young Spartans were instruments of enforcement, operating autonomously within the state's boundaries to ensure that threats could be neutralized before gaining traction. This system depended not only on lethal action, but on the cultivation of uncertainty and fear, compelling helots to internalize control as a constant element of their existence. The operational dimension of the Krypteia required mastery of reconnaissance, stealth, and decisive violence. Young men memorized the rhythms of helot life, noting social hierarchies, familial arrangements, and labor patterns. Targets were selected carefully, focusing on those whose physical capabilities, influence, or leadership potential could foster resistance. Execution demanded speed, discretion, and efficiency. The operatives carried minimal equipment, daggers, short spears, and small clubs, sufficient for silent eliminations but not open combat. Missions were often seasonal, timed to coincide with moments of social vulnerability, such as harvests or periods following military mobilization when local routines were disrupted. By acting proactively rather than reactively, Sparta neutralized threats before they could crystallize into organized revolt, achieving dominance with a level of efficiency rare in the ancient world. Psychologically, the Krypteia's influence permeated every aspect of helot life. Fear became habitual and self-reinforcing. Helots adapted by suppressing displays of strength or leadership, avoiding any action that might draw attention. Routine work, communal gatherings, and even familial interactions were conducted under continuous vigilance. The invisible nature of the Krypteia amplified terror. Operatives could strike without warning, leaving the population uncertain of when or where violence might occur. This internalized fear was more effective than public punishments, producing a population disciplined through anticipation rather than through overt coercion. Helots became both the observers and the observed, constrained by a system that relied on psychological domination as much as physical threat. Compliance was thus achieved indirectly, embedded into the rhythms of daily life. Historical sources, including Plutarch and Xenophon, reinforce the systematic approach of the Krypteia. Strong and influential helots were targeted deliberately, with the goal of preventing revolt before it could take shape. Operations were calculated rather than arbitrary, guided by observation and intelligence. By removing potential leaders and capable individuals, Sparta ensured that fear remained pervasive, obedience habitual, and rebellion nearly impossible. The combination of selectivity and unpredictability maximized both the physical and psychological effectiveness of these missions. The Krypteia functioned as an instrument of statecraft, demonstrating that control could be maintained through anticipation and discretion rather than through constant direct oversight. For Spartan participants, the Krypteia served as a formative rite. It instilled discipline, decisiveness, and loyalty to the state, reinforcing the association between authority and the capacity for lethal action. Participation produced a generation of men who internalized the principles of control and hierarchy, capable of sustaining the social and military order of the polis. The program linked operational necessity with cultural transmission, embedding vigilance, ruthlessness, and obedience into Spartan identity. Young men were trained to perceive power as responsibility executed through action, reinforcing both internal cohesion and the capacity to maintain dominance over a population vastly larger than their own. The Krypteia thus ensured that the values of Spartan society were reproduced through generations, merging social indoctrination with functional enforcement. Strategically, the Krypteia represented an advanced understanding of internal security. Unlike other Greek city-states, which relied on walls, militias, and public tribunals, Sparta implemented a covert system capable of maintaining control over a subjugated majority with minimal direct intervention. Intelligence, observation, and preemptive action allowed the Spartans to maintain internal stability while deploying forces externally. The Krypteia exemplified the integration of psychological and operational strategy. Fear was weaponized as a tool of governance, producing compliance without excessive expenditure of resources. By embedding control into anticipation and perception, Sparta created a durable system capable of sustaining its militarized society and ensuring generational continuity of authority. The long-term impact on the helot population was enduring. Fear constrained social cohesion, limited collective action, and preserved labor productivity. Communities adapted defensive behaviors, emphasizing concealment, restraint, and avoidance of attention. Over time, these adaptations reinforced the permanence of Spartan dominance. The Krypteia ensured that compliance became habitual, internalized, and self-regulated, reducing the need for ongoing intervention. Fear itself became a method of governance, invisible but omnipresent, ensuring that the numerical superiority of the helot population did not translate into effective resistance. Sparta relied on this psychological mechanism as much as on physical enforcement to maintain the structure of its society. Through operational precision, psychological influence, and strategic foresight, the Krypteia exemplified one of the most effective systems of internal control in classical Greece. Surveillance, selective violence, and anticipation allowed Sparta to maintain dominance over a population that vastly outnumbered its citizens. For helots, existence was shaped by fear and anticipation of the unseen. For Spartans, the system ensured generational continuity of discipline, obedience, and martial excellence. By embedding terror into the rhythms of daily life, Sparta created a self-sustaining mechanism of control, demonstrating a deliberate, calculated approach to governance and social preservation that defined the polis across centuries.
The Krypteia became a rite of passage that fused operational necessity with cultural transmission, embedding values of vigilance, ruthlessness, and discipline into Spartan identity. Through this mechanism, the elite ensured continuity of social and military dominance across generations. Strategically, the Krypteia represented an advanced approach to internal security. Unlike other Greek city-states, which relied on walls, militias, and public tribunals, Sparta implemented a preemptive, covert system that maintained control over a majority population without excessive manpower. Intelligence, observation, and targeted action created a proactive model of enforcement, allowing the state to preserve internal stability while directing its conventional forces outward. The Krypteia exemplified the integration of psychological and operational strategy, using anticipation and terror as instruments of governance. It ensured that fear was systemic, continuous, and self-reinforcing, preserving the integrity of the militarized polis against internal threats that could have otherwise destabilized it. The long-term effects on helot society were profound. Fear limited collective action, shaped community structures, and ensured that labor productivity was maintained to support the Spartan citizenry. Villages developed defensive postures, emphasizing concealment and restraint. Over time, these behaviors became internalized, producing a population regulated by anticipation rather than constant oversight. The Krypteia transformed terror into a mechanism of social discipline, ensuring that numerical superiority did not translate into effective resistance. Compliance became habitual, and fear itself functioned as a tool of governance, sustaining a system that preserved both economic and military foundations. Through operational precision, psychological influence, and strategic foresight, the Krypteia illustrates the complex integration of surveillance, selective violence, and social control in Sparta. It secured the city-state against potential insurrection while reproducing cultural and martial values across generations. Helots lived under the shadow of invisible enforcement, shaping life through anticipation and restraint. Spartan participants internalized the mechanisms of authority and control, ensuring continuity of a militarized society. The Krypteia's efficiency, subtlety, and psychological sophistication demonstrate a deliberate, calculated system in which power was maintained not through constant display, but through anticipation, internalized fear, and the disciplined application of lethal skill.
The Krypteia was not simply an instrument of enforcement. It was a deliberate system that embedded control within the very structure of Spartan society. Helots, who outnumbered the citizen population by several multiples, were essential to the survival of the state, yet their very existence represented an ever-present threat. The Krypteia transformed this threat into an opportunity for strategic control, converting fear into a tool as effective as any weapon. Young Spartan men, trained rigorously in the agoge, were conditioned to endure hardship, suppress fear, and operate independently with lethal precision. Their training in endurance, observation, and tactical decision-making was directly applied in the field, where stealth and knowledge of terrain determined both survival and effectiveness. They moved through olive groves, rocky slopes, and cultivated fields with an intimate understanding of the landscape, striking selectively against helots whose strength, leadership, or potential defiance posed a risk to the stability of the polis. Each action served a dual purpose. It neutralized a potential insurgent, while simultaneously reinforcing the omnipresent climate of fear necessary to maintain control over a vastly larger population. The political function of the Krypteia was inseparable from its operational one. Sparta's dual kingship, the Council of Elders, and the Ephors together created a governance system requiring meticulous management of authority and discipline. While one king often campaigned abroad, the other oversaw domestic matters, and the Ephors ensured legal and civic order. Within this structure, the Krypteia occupied a liminal space, acting outside the public eye while executing state policy with lethal discretion. Its covert operations allowed Spartan leaders to neutralize internal threats without provoking unrest or sympathy for helots. Compliance became habitual, internalized through uncertainty and anticipation rather than overt enforcement. Helots were unable to predict when or where the Krypteia would act, creating a pervasive, invisible system of control in which fear itself governed behavior, both individually and communally. Operationally, the Krypteia combined surveillance, intelligence gathering, and targeted execution in a continuous cycle. Young Spartans memorized helot routines, labor patterns, and social hierarchies, learning to distinguish potential leaders or threats from compliant individuals. Missions required speed, discretion, and efficiency. Operatives carried minimal equipment, often daggers, short spears, and small clubs, optimized for silent lethality rather than direct confrontation. Seasonal timing played a crucial role. Operations coincided with periods of vulnerability, such as harvests or post-mobilization, when local routines were disrupted. By acting proactively rather than reactively, Sparta neutralized potential insurrection before it could crystallize, maintaining dominance with a level of efficiency and foresight unmatched by contemporaneous Greek city-states. The Krypteia exemplified the integration of reconnaissance, tactical precision, and psychological influence as components of internal governance. The psychological impact of the Krypteia on helots was profound. Fear became habitual, shaping every aspect of daily life. Individuals suppressed signs of physical strength, leadership, or assertiveness to avoid drawing attention. Even routine labor, plowing, transporting produce, or assembling for communal tasks, was performed under constant vigilance. The invisibility of the Krypteia amplified the terror. Its operatives could strike without warning, and helots could never predict when or where lethal enforcement would occur. This anticipation functioned as an invisible mechanism of social control, producing compliance without the need for visible enforcement or continuous supervision. Fear itself became an instrument of governance, shaping behavior and ensuring submission as effectively as any armed presence. Historical accounts underscore the systematized nature of these operations. Plutarch emphasizes that the strongest and most influential helots were specifically targeted, those most capable of organizing resistance or inciting rebellion. Xenophon confirms that such actions were strategic rather than arbitrary, guided by intelligence and observation. This combination of selectivity and unpredictability maximized the psychological impact of the Krypteia while maintaining operational efficiency. The resulting social environment ensured that obedience was habitual, rebellion nearly impossible, and the perception of Spartan omnipotence constant. The Krypteia functioned as both enforcement and social education, teaching through absence and fear that resistance carried lethal consequences. For the Spartan participants, the Krypteia was formative in shaping identity and reinforcing state ideology. It instilled loyalty, decisiveness, and an understanding of power as execution, linking authority directly to the capacity for action. Participation reinforced hierarchy externally through the suppression of helots and internally by producing disciplined citizens capable of sustaining the social and military order. The Krypteia functioned as a cultural instrument, embedding vigilance, ruthlessness, and discipline into Spartan consciousness. This dual purpose, operational necessity and cultural transmission, ensured continuity across generations, producing a citizenry equipped to maintain dominance while internalizing the principles that defined Spartan identity. Strategically, the Krypteia represented an unprecedented approach to internal security. Unlike other city-states, which relied on walls, militias, and public tribunals, Sparta implemented a preemptive, covert system capable of controlling a majority population with minimal direct intervention. Intelligence, observation, and targeted strikes created a proactive framework that maintained stability while allowing the citizen soldiers to focus on external campaigns. By integrating psychological domination with tactical enforcement, Sparta converted fear into a self-regulating mechanism of governance. The Krypteia's effectiveness lay not only in its lethal efficiency, but also in its ability to embed obedience within the social fabric, preserving the militarized state across generations. The long-term consequences for helots were systematic and enduring. Fear constrained social cohesion, limited collective action, and ensured the productivity necessary to sustain the Spartan citizenry. Villages adopted defensive behaviors, emphasizing concealment, restraint, and submission. Over time, these adaptations became internalized, producing a population disciplined by anticipation rather than continuous supervision. The Krypteia transformed terror into an invisible, self-perpetuating mechanism of control, ensuring that numerical superiority did not translate into rebellion. Compliance became habitual, and fear itself functioned as governance, silently sustaining the social hierarchy and preserving the structural integrity of the polis. Through operational precision, psychological influence, and strategic foresight, the Krypteia exemplified the deliberate integration of surveillance, selective violence, and social engineering. It secured Sparta against internal threats while reproducing the cultural and martial values central to the polis. Helots lived under a constant shadow of anticipation, shaping behavior and daily life around invisible enforcement. Spartan participants internalized the mechanisms of authority, ensuring continuity of a militarized society. By embedding fear into the rhythms of existence, the Krypteia created a self-sustaining system of dominance, demonstrating a calculated, generational approach to governance that sustained one of the most disciplined and enduring city-states of the ancient world. Unlike other Greek city-states, which relied on walls, militias, or public tribunals, Sparta implemented a proactive, invisible system capable of maintaining control with minimal direct oversight. Observation, intelligence, and targeted preemptive action allowed the state to maintain internal stability while preserving manpower for external campaigns. By integrating psychological manipulation with operational efficiency, Sparta converted fear into a structural mechanism of governance, sustaining the social hierarchy without constant visible enforcement. The Krypteia demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power, where anticipation and perception were as critical as direct action. The long-term consequences for helot society were systemic. Fear constrained social cohesion, discouraged collective action, and ensured continued productivity necessary to sustain the citizen population. Communities adopted defensive behaviors, emphasizing concealment, restraint, and compliance. Over time, these adaptations became internalized, producing a population disciplined by anticipation rather than continuous supervision. The Krypteia ensured that numerical superiority did not translate into effective rebellion. Obedience became habitual, and fear itself functioned as governance, maintaining structural integrity, preserving the social hierarchy, and sustaining the militarized state. Through its integration of observation, psychological influence, and strategic foresight, the Krypteia exemplifies the deliberate orchestration of internal control in Sparta. Surveillance, selective elimination, and fear ensured the subjugation of the helot majority while reinforcing Spartan martial and cultural values. Helots existed under continuous anticipation, shaping life around the invisible presence of lethal authority. Spartan participants internalized the mechanisms of enforcement, perpetuating a disciplined and hierarchized society. The Krypteia's efficiency, subtlety, and sophistication reveal the calculated methods by which Sparta preserved its dominance, maintaining one of the most rigid and enduring militarized societies of the ancient Greek world. The Krypteia functioned not merely as a security force, but as a deliberate instrument of social engineering, shaping the behavior, psychology, and daily routines of the helot population. These subjugated people, essential to the Spartan economy, lived under constant threat. The Krypteia converted the ever-present danger posed by their numbers into a controlled system of dominance. Young Spartan men, rigorously trained through the agoge, applied lessons in endurance, observation, and decisive action in real-world environments. They moved under cover of night, navigating fields, olive groves, and rocky terrain, identifying helots whose strength, influence, or perceived ambition represented a threat to Spartan order. Eliminations were selective and strategic, reinforcing a culture of fear and ensuring compliance across villages. Each operation combined lethal efficiency with psychological impact, creating a social environment in which obedience was internalized and resistance became synonymous with mortal risk. Politically, the Krypteia's existence reflected the complexities of Spartan governance. Sparta's dual kingship, the Ephyrs, and the Gerousia balanced authority across the polis, requiring careful maintenance of social stability. While one king campaigned abroad, the other managed domestic affairs, and the Ephyrs ensured adherence to civic law. The Krypteia occupied a liminal space, acting with sanctioned authority but outside public oversight. This covert positioning allowed Spartan leaders to suppress internal threats without inciting unrest or sympathy for helots. Fear became the primary mechanism of control. Helots lived under the implicit knowledge that lethal enforcement could occur at any time. The uncertainty of the Krypteia's operations imposed self-discipline upon the population, turning anticipation of violence into an internalized instrument of governance. Operationally, the Krypteia combined surveillance, intelligence gathering, and targeted elimination. Recruits memorized labor routines, social hierarchies, and communal dynamics, distinguishing compliant individuals from potential leaders. Execution demanded precision, speed, and discretion, often employing minimal tools such as daggers, short spears, and small clubs designed for silent lethality. Seasonal timing was crucial. Missions aligned with moments of heightened vulnerability, such as harvest periods or post-mobilization intervals, when social routines were disrupted. By acting preemptively, Sparta neutralized threats before they could coalesce into organized rebellion. The Krypteia integrated tactical observation with lethal enforcement, creating a proactive model of internal security that combined physical suppression with psychological control, ensuring that the numerical advantage of the helots did not threaten the citizen elite. The psychological consequences for the helots were profound. Fear became habitual, shaping individual conduct and communal organization. Displays of strength, leadership, or initiative were suppressed to avoid attention. Routine labor, plowing, transporting goods, communal work, was carried out under constant vigilance, guided by the possibility of unseen observation. The Krypteia's invisibility amplified the terror, ensuring that compliance was habitual and internalized rather than enforced through continuous presence. Helots became self-regulating participants in their own subjugation, disciplined through anticipation and the knowledge of potential lethal consequences. The system transformed fear into a durable mechanism of social control, minimizing the need for direct oversight while maintaining order. Historical accounts emphasize the deliberate nature of Krypteia operations. Plutarch notes the selective targeting of the strongest and most influential helots, those capable of organizing revolt. Xenophon corroborates the strategic intent, noting the careful observation and intelligence used to guide operations. This combination of selectivity and unpredictability maximized both physical and psychological effects. By removing potential leaders and capable individuals, Sparta ensured that rebellion was improbable and that fear permeated daily life. The Krypteia functioned as enforcement and social education simultaneously, teaching through absence, anticipation, and lethal authority. Helots internalized the consequences of resistance, producing a population conditioned to submission without continuous intervention. For Spartan participants, the Krypteia was formative, shaping identity and reinforcing civic ideology. It instilled decisiveness, loyalty, and the understanding that authority required the capacity for precise action. Participation reinforced social hierarchy externally, through subjugation of helots, and internally, by producing disciplined citizens capable of sustaining the social and military order. The institution functioned as a cultural instrument, transmitting values of vigilance, ruthlessness, and strategic foresight across generations. Recruits internalized the link between power and responsibility, recognizing that the preservation of authority depended upon skill, discretion, and action. The Krypteia thus ensured the continuity of Spartan dominance, producing citizens trained both in martial skill and the psychological management of a subjugated majority. Strategically, the Krypteia exemplified an advanced model of internal security. Unlike other Greek city-states, which relied on walls, militias, or tribunals, Sparta implemented a proactive, covert system capable of controlling a majority population efficiently. Observation, intelligence, and preemptive action allowed the state to maintain stability while deploying its conventional forces externally. Psychological domination, combined with lethal precision, created a self-sustaining system of governance. Anticipation of violence became as critical as the enforcement itself, embedding compliance within social norms and daily routines. The Krypteia ensured the continuity of a militarized, hierarchical society that could survive internal threat while preserving Spartan identity and authority. The long-term effects on helot society were systemic. Fear constrained social cohesion, discouraged collective action, and ensured continued productivity to support Spartan citizens. Villages adopted defensive behaviors, emphasizing concealment, restraint, and compliance. Over generations, these adaptations became internalized, producing a population disciplined through anticipation rather than direct supervision. The Krypteia converted terror into an invisible, self-reinforcing system of governance, ensuring that numerical superiority did not translate into effective rebellion. Compliance became habitual, fear became routine, and the social hierarchy remained stable across decades. Through this mechanism, Sparta maintained control, reinforced its militarized society, and embedded obedience into the very structure of the polis. The Krypteia was not simply a tool of enforcement. It was a system designed to embed control into the very fabric of Spartan society. Its operations relied on the careful combination of intelligence, lethal precision, and psychological domination, ensuring that a citizen minority could maintain authority over a helot majority. Young Spartan men, conditioned through the agoge to endure hunger, fatigue, and exposure, applied their training in real-world conditions. They moved silently through olive groves, fields, and rocky terrain, observing and evaluating the helot population. Targets were selected for strength, leadership potential, or defiance. Each action served both practical and symbolic purposes. It eliminated a potential threat while reinforcing a pervasive climate of fear, ensuring compliance without visible enforcement. The Krypteia thus functioned as a preemptive instrument, neutralizing insurgency before it could coalesce and embedding obedience into the daily rhythms of helot life. The political significance of the Krypteia was inseparable from its operational function. Sparta's dual kingship, the Gerousia and the Ephors, created a distributed system of governance, in which the maintenance of internal stability was paramount. One king often campaigned abroad, while the other managed domestic affairs, and the Ephors oversaw civic and judicial matters. Within this framework, the Krypteia operated in a liminal space, acting with sanctioned authority while remaining invisible to the general populace. Its secrecy allowed Spartan leaders to act decisively against potential threats without provoking unrest or sympathy for the helots. The mere possibility of being observed or targeted instilled hypervigilance in the helot population, internalizing control through anticipation. Fear became self-enforcing, compliance was habitual, and rebellion nearly impossible. In this sense, the Krypteia was as much psychological as it was physical, shaping behavior and communal organization through the invisible weight of authority. Operationally, the Krypteia was a fusion of reconnaissance, intelligence, and precision execution. Young Spartans memorized labor routines, social hierarchies, and family networks, learning to distinguish potential leaders or influential helots from compliant individuals. The selection of targets emphasized physical strength, leadership qualities, and the potential to inspire revolt. Execution demanded speed, stealth, and efficiency with minimal equipment. Daggers, short spears, and small clubs, optimized for silent action rather than open confrontation. Seasonal timing was critical. Operations often coincided with periods of vulnerability, such as harvests or post-mobilization, when social routines were temporarily disrupted. By acting preemptively, the Krypteia neutralized threats before they could organize, demonstrating a strategic foresight that combined psychological insight with military discipline. The system integrated surveillance, lethal action, and behavioral conditioning into a coherent strategy for social control. The psychological consequences for helots were profound. Fear became embedded in everyday life, regulating individual and communal behavior. Displays of strength, assertiveness, or leadership were suppressed to avoid drawing attention. Even routine labor, plowing, transporting produce, or performing communal tasks, was carried out under constant anticipation of observation or attack. The invisibility of the Krypteia heightened the impact of its presence, ensuring that compliance was self-regulated. Anticipation replaced enforcement. Helots adapted defensively, internalizing the constraints of their position. Fear functioned as governance, shaping behavior, social structures, and labor practices without continuous oversight. The Krypteia exemplified the effective use of psychological mechanisms to preserve hierarchical dominance in a population that vastly outnumbered the ruling minority. Historical sources highlight the deliberate nature of these operations. Plutarch notes that the strongest and most influential helots, those capable of organizing resistance, were specifically targeted. Xenophon confirms that the selection of victims was systematic and strategic rather than arbitrary. This combination of selectivity and unpredictability maximized both physical and psychological effects. By removing potential leaders and capable individuals, Sparta ensured that rebellion remained improbable and that the perception of control was constant. The Krypteia functioned as both an enforcement mechanism and a pedagogical instrument, demonstrating through absence and lethal action that resistance carried fatal consequences. Obedience became habitual, internalized, and self-regulating, preserving the structural stability of the polis. For Spartan participants, the Krypteia was formative. It instilled decisiveness, loyalty, and the understanding that authority required the ability to act decisively and lethally. Participation reinforced hierarchy externally through subjugation of helots, and internally by producing disciplined citizens capable of maintaining social and military order. The system served as a cultural instrument, transmitting values of vigilance, ruthlessness, and strategic foresight across generations. Recruits internalized the principle that power was inseparable from responsibility and execution. The Krypteia thus ensured the continuity of Spartan authority, producing citizens capable of preserving dominance over a population that vastly outnumbered them, while embedding the moral and psychological codes of the state into the next generation of leaders. Strategically, the Krypteia represented an unparalleled model of internal security. Unlike other Greek city-states, which relied on walls, militias, and tribunals, Sparta implemented a preemptive, covert system that maintained control efficiently. Surveillance, intelligence, and selective strikes allowed the state to neutralize internal threats while directing its conventional forces externally. The combination of lethal precision and psychological conditioning produced a self-sustaining system of governance, embedding fear into daily life and ensuring compliance through anticipation. The Krypteia preserved both internal order and external military capacity, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of power, strategy, and human behavior. The long-term effects on helot society were systemic. Fear constrained social cohesion, limited collective action, and ensured continued labor productivity essential to Sparta's survival. Villages adopted defensive behaviors, emphasizing concealment, restraint, and submission. Over generations, these adaptations became internalized, producing a population regulated by anticipation rather than direct supervision. The Krypteia transformed terror into a durable mechanism of social control, ensuring that numerical advantage did not translate into effective rebellion. Compliance became habitual, fear became routine, and the social hierarchy remained stable. Through this system, Sparta preserved its militarized structure, maintained economic stability, and ensured the continuity of its distinctive social order across generations. The Krypteia was more than an institution. It was the structural spine of Spartan dominance, a system designed to ensure that the polis could endure despite the constant threat posed by the helot majority. These subjugated people, essential to Sparta's economy, were physically and numerically superior to the citizen population, yet their labor was indispensable. The Krypteia transformed this latent danger into a controlled instrument of state authority. Young Spartan men, trained rigorously in the agoge, were selected for their physical endurance, tactical skill, and psychological resilience. They were conditioned to endure hunger, exposure, and fatigue, to suppress fear, and to operate independently, applying skills honed in childhood to lethal effect. Under cover of darkness, they moved silently through olive groves, cultivated fields, and rugged hillsides, observing helots for strength, influence, or leadership potential. Targets were carefully selected, and eliminations were executed with precision. Each operation removed immediate threats while broadcasting a silent, omnipresent warning. Resistance carried the certainty of death. Politically, the Krypteia was embedded within Sparta's uniquely structured governance. The dual kingship, the Ephyrs, and the Gerousia collectively regulated the balance of power. One king typically led military campaigns abroad, while the other supervised domestic affairs, and the Ephyrs enforced legal and civic oversight. Within this framework, the Krypteia operated in a liminal space, sanctioned to act decisively, yet invisible to the general population. Its secrecy permitted Spartan authorities to neutralize internal threats without provoking unrest or sympathy for the helots. Compliance was internalized. The anticipation of lethal enforcement created self-regulating behavior among the oppressed. Helots were never certain when or where the Krypteia would strike, a pervasive uncertainty that reinforced submission without the need for overt displays of power. Fear itself became a governance tool, as effective as any walls, militia, or tribunal could have been. Operationally, the Krypteia integrated reconnaissance, intelligence, and execution into a continuous system. Young Spartans memorized helot routines, labor patterns, and social hierarchies, identifying individuals capable of organizing resistance or influencing others. Execution required speed, discretion, and efficiency. Operatives carried minimal equipment, daggers, short spears, and small clubs, designed for silent action rather than open conflict. Seasonal timing was critical. Missions coincided with periods of social vulnerability, such as harvests or post-mobilization, when community routines were disrupted. By acting preemptively, Sparta neutralized threats before rebellion could coalesce. The Krypteia functioned as an intelligence apparatus, strike force, and psychological instrument simultaneously, demonstrating a strategic understanding that internal control required both action and perception. The psychological impact on helots was pervasive and enduring. Fear governed daily life. Individuals suppressed displays of strength, assertiveness, and leadership, and even routine labor. Plowing, transporting produce, or gathering for communal work was carried out under constant vigilance. The Krypteia's invisibility amplified the terror. Helots could not predict when or where enforcement would occur. Compliance was internalized and habitual. Fear regulated social behavior as effectively as any explicit rule. Communities developed defensive structures, emphasizing secrecy, restraint, and obedience. Anticipation replaced direct enforcement as the primary mechanism of control. Through this combination of psychological pressure and physical threat, the Krypteia produced a population that maintained productivity while remaining subservient, internalizing submission as a condition of survival. Historical sources underline the deliberate and systematic nature of these operations. Plutarch records the targeted elimination of the strongest and most influential helots, those capable of organizing resistance or leading rebellion. Xenophon corroborates the strategic intent, noting the careful observation, intelligence gathering, and selective execution employed. This combination of discretion and unpredictability maximized both psychological and operational efficiency. By removing potential leaders and physically capable individuals, Sparta maintained the perception of absolute control. The Krypteia functioned simultaneously as enforcement and instruction, demonstrating that defiance carried fatal consequences. The system internalized authority within the population, producing compliance that required minimal continuous supervision. For Spartan participants, the Krypteia was a crucible shaping identity and reinforcing state ideology. It instilled decisiveness, vigilance, and loyalty, linking authority directly to the capacity to act lethally and effectively. Participation reinforced social hierarchy externally, through suppression of helots, and internally, by producing disciplined citizens capable of preserving military and social order. The institution functioned as a vehicle for cultural transmission, embedding values of strategic thinking, ruthlessness, and endurance across generations. Recruits internalized the principle that power required responsibility and action, ensuring that Spartan citizens would continue to reproduce the mechanisms of control. In this way, the Krypteia sustained both the operational and ideological integrity of the polis. Strategically, the Krypteia exemplified a proactive and sophisticated model of internal security. Unlike other Greek city-states, which relied on walls, militias, or public tribunals, Sparta implemented a covert system capable of maintaining control over a majority population efficiently. Intelligence, observation, and preemptive elimination allowed the state to maintain stability while preserving manpower for external campaigns. Psychological domination, combined with lethal efficiency, created a self-sustaining governance system. Anticipation of violence became central. Fear was weaponized and internalized, ensuring compliance without excessive resource expenditure. The Krypteia preserved internal order and reinforced Spartan martial identity, demonstrating an advanced understanding of governance and human psychology. The long-term consequences for helot society were systematic and enduring. Fear limited collective action, regulated social cohesion, and ensured continued labor productivity. Villages developed defensive practices, emphasizing concealment, restraint, and submission. Over generations, these behaviors became internalized, producing a population disciplined by anticipation rather than constant supervision. The Krypteia transformed terror into an invisible, self-reinforcing mechanism of social control, ensuring that numerical advantage did not translate into effective rebellion. Compliance became habitual, fear became routine, and the social hierarchy remained unbroken. Through this system, Sparta maintained economic stability, social order, and military dominance across decades. Ultimately, the Krypteia was a testament to the integration of operational efficiency, psychological manipulation, and strategic foresight. Surveillance, selective violence, and anticipation secured the Spartan state against internal threats while reproducing the cultural and martial values essential to the polis. Helots lived under the constant shadow of invisible authority, shaping daily life through fear and anticipation. Spartan participants internalized the mechanisms of enforcement, perpetuating a disciplined, militarized society. The Krypteia's precision, subtlety, and systemic sophistication ensured that dominance was maintained invisibly, embedding obedience, vigilance, and restraint into the social fabric. It represents a deliberate, generational strategy, sustaining one of history's most enduring and rigidly hierarchical city-states, where terror itself became an instrument of governance.